Good afternoon and welcome to today's CIPR Channel Islands webinar, which is part of the CIPR's series of climate change events, which the Chartered Institute of Public Relations has been focusing on since COP26. My name's Nicole Coverwell and I'm the incoming chair of the Channel Islands Group. I'm joined today by our presenter, Jane Burns. Jane has been involved in delivering the carbon neutral roadmap and her background is in youth and community work, and she's very passionate about making sure that everyone has a voice in our response to the climate emergency. So communications is at the forefront of her mind throughout her work. Today we're focusing on the draft carbon neutral framework, which was published today by Jersey's Minister for the Environment. So really timely, and we're really grateful to Jane for making time today to present to us on what is ultimately a really busy day for her. The roadmap outlines the steps that Jersey needs to achieve net zero by 2050. And it's the start of a consultation period, and islanders in Jersey are encouraged to feed back on the proposals. And, you know, clearly this is a very important step in how Jersey will play its part to tackle the climate emergency that we're facing globally. The policies are split into 4 areas. There's transport, heating, other emissions, and also some enabling policies. And Jane is going to share her insights into these policy areas. And these will clearly affect all organisations that we work for as clients or in-house as PR professionals over the coming years. And whilst clearly there's a Jersey focus, I know our colleagues joining us from Guernsey want to know more about how they can help their Jersey-based clients. Before I hand over to Jane, I'm just going to cover off a couple of housekeeping points. We are recording the webinar, just so you're aware, and it will be available afterwards on the CIPR website. There are CPD points for CIPR members, and I'll remind you of that at the end of the session. And if you have any questions for Jane, please pop them in the Q&A box down the bottom, and we'll go through those afterwards with Jane, or Jane might pause in the middle to answer some questions. But in the meantime, I'll hand over to Jane, and she's going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the roadmap.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm just going to share my screen with you all, so hopefully this works okay. My name's Jane. I'm the Sustainability and Climate Change Engagement Manager for the Government of Jersey. And as you've just heard, today's a really big day for us. So we've actually published our draft carbon neutral roadmap today. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about, but with the focus on the people-powered approach that we've taken. So the word draft is really key. So it's not that we haven't finished our homework and we've put it out a bit early. The reason it's a draft is we haven't finished our consultation process. So we're actually inviting islanders in Jersey to give us their feedback right through to the 31st of January, where we will then take all of the ideas and the thoughts and the feedback from the consultation, revise the carbon neutral roadmap, and that carbon neutral roadmap will then be what's lodged for our States Assembly to debate. So the word draft is because it is really important to us that we continue to have this conversation with people. So what I'm going to cover today, a little bit of background. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the people-powered approach. And then what I've called the juicy stuff is we'll have a little look at some of the policies that are in there. So mindful that people in Guernsey will have clients in Jersey, but also the people who are based in Jersey, some of these policies are going to impact your actual lives. So you might want to know on a personal level. I won't go into all of the policies because there's 30 odd of them and we could be here till midnight. So I'll just go on the ones that I think might have a particular interest to you or potentially to your clients. So starting with the background, I really hope you can see this graphic okay. So basically what this shows is the timeline of what we've been working to and are continuing to work on. So the climate emergency was declared by the States Assembly back in 2019. And you might be wondering why we're only drafting the lodge in December 2021. But we literally declared the climate emergency, had 6 months to develop what we then wrote, which was the carbon neutral strategy. That was then debated by the States Assembly and was unanimously adopted in February, end of February, I think it was the 23rd of 2020. That was closely followed by our sustainable transport policy, which was debated mid-March in 2020. And then literally that afternoon, we had our first cases of COVID found in Jersey, and so a lot of us ended up finding that we were redeployed into some weird and wonderful roles that wasn't doing anything with the climate emergency. So what the mandate, if you like, from the carbon neutral strategy set out was that we would want to adopt a people-powered approach, as we refer to it. So we have a kind of a key question, which was how would we become carbon neutral by 2030? And I'm sure the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that actually we talk a lot about becoming net zero by 2050. So we'll explain the nuances of that. But from a PR perspective, climate change is actually really complicated, and what's really important to us is actually getting people to understand some of the complicated language and terminology that we use. So there are differences between things like terms such as carbon neutral and net zero, and we talk about emission scopes and all that kind of stuff. And actually for people to be able to have a real say on things, a lot of what we need to do is help people understand some of the terminology we're using. So the carbon neutral roadmap was preceded by the preferred strategy, and we published that last month. And what the preferred strategy really did, it was a beast of a document. If any of you had the joy of reading it, I think it was like 140 odd pages. I can't remember quite now, but basically it set out 5 key principles, if you like, from which we've now based the actual carbon neutral roadmap draft. So what we talked about was the pathway to net zero. We address in that things like the island's energy market. We also look at the financing behind it, because obviously tackling climate change is going to be quite expensive to decarbonise our entire economy. We also looked at the importance of having a policy programme developed, and then finally the fifth strategic priority was really about becoming carbon neutral. So I won't dwell on that too much, but we'll move on. So what this diagram shows, and actually this diagram does apply to Guernsey as well, is if you've been working looking at sustainability since COP, you may have noticed that at COP it was agreed that the island jurisdictions, so Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, would become signatories to the Paris Agreement through ratification. So basically the UK agreement to the Paris Agreement will be extended to the Channel Islands, very similar in the way that we did with Kyoto a number of years ago. So what this means for us is, by doing this, that we've basically said that we're going to align with the UK's trajectory in order to meet net zero and what they have set as targets. So what that's saying is that by 2030 we will have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 68%, and the point of when we reduce from is 1990. So that's when the Kyoto Protocol was first come up with. So we set the baseline in 1990. So by 2030 we need to have reduced by 68%. By 2035 we should have reduced by at least 78%, leaving us with next to nothing by 2050, which is when we'll become net zero. So this beautiful graph, which we use all the time, is very difficult to explain to people, and that's something that we've been challenged with through our process. But the dark line, basically to the left of the graph, is showing our historical emissions. So you can see that we had quite a dramatic drop at one point, and that's when we stopped generating electricity on islands and started to import low carbon energy from the European grid. So our current contract is with France, and we import hydro and nuclear energy, which are low carbon. We differ from Guernsey at this point because our electricity generation also includes the emissions from our energy recovery facility. So because we manage our household rubbish, if you like, on islands, we capture those emissions and they're counted in our energy supply, where in Guernsey your domestic household waste is dealt with off island. So those emissions, coming back to the complicated world of scope, those emissions aren't counted as your scope 1 emissions, which means you don't internationally report them, which we do. So it just looks a little bit unbalanced if you compare our emissions. So you'll see that the dark line has reduced. So we know that since our 1990 base level, we've reduced our emissions by roughly 36%. These figures are all internationally reported, and we report 2 years in arrears because it goes through a proper verification process. So all the figures I'm referring to are from 2019, just for your information. So the red line would be if we did literally nothing from now on, where our emissions would sit. If we did the light blue line, that's the current pathway that the states members have agreed to. So that's in alignment with the Kyoto Protocol, which is to reduce by 80% by 2050. And the puce line, as I was told helpfully by one of our key stakeholders, the puce line is our path if we are to meet our targets and get to net zero by 2050. So I won't go into massive detail, and I'm sorry this has come out a little bit pixelated. I don't know why it has, because it wasn't when I put the slide in, or maybe it was, I just didn't notice. So what you can see here, these are the scope 1 emissions. And when we talk about scope 1, these are basically the emissions that we generate on islands. So you can see the bright blue circle, which represents 44% of our emissions, which come from transport. And then the next 2 big blobs, the kind of peachy orangey colour and the teal or green, they are business and residential, and they are primarily heating. So we're talking about space heating of buildings. So if you combine those 2, we know our biggest sources of emissions are transport and heating. So what we've been doing since 2019, when we declared the climate emergency, is trying to deliver what we've called this people-powered approach. If any of you were a child in the 70s like me, you may remember System Smith, so a bit of power to the people here. But for those of you who don't remember that, just ignore that little reference. So the people-powered process really comes about, we see it as a circle. We see that it's really about us talking to people. Climate change is a global issue, and actually it isn't something that the government on their own can fix. So it's important to us that we bring people with us on this journey, because this is about changing how we live our lives, how our island works, how our world works. So we obviously put a lot of work into the preparatory stage of our people-powered process, and then we got hit by COVID and had to redo all that prep work to think about how life has changed, how we're all a little bit hybrid in our ways of work, or back to working from home or whatever. We then delivered what we called our explore phase. I'll come into all this a little bit more as we go. We then had a deliberation process where we held a systems assembly on climate change. Their recommendations were then fed to the States Assembly, where they held an in-committee debate. They then decided what they liked and didn't like from that. We've had a political steering group working with us very closely since the Systems Assembly to pull together the draft carbon neutral roadmap. And then the idea is that at this point, we kind of go back out to people and say, you said, we listened, but is this what you meant? We then get that bit of feedback so that we can then tweak the carbon neutral roadmap. That will then go to the States debate, depending how that debate goes, what the amendments are. We will then have what we would see as our long-term climate action plan. So the perform stage for us is, this is just the beginning. We need to be delivering. Obviously, we're delivering stuff already because it is an emergency and we do need to crack on. So it's really to give you that kind of circular approach that we're taking to this. So for those of you who don't remember 2019 was a lovely time because we didn't have COVID. We were all naive as to what was coming, and we were really becoming very climate aware at that time. And it felt for environmentalists like this was our chance. This was, people were listening, they were taking it seriously. So in Jersey, and I believe in Guernsey as well, we had a series of student strikes, which were inspired by Greta and the Fridays for Futures movement. So we had a number of strikes by our young people that were outside the States Assembly, and they were very successful in getting their voices heard. And the new term of government had just made them a commitment to put children first. So obviously one of the politicians listened to the students and put in a proposition to declare a climate emergency. So really this entire process has kind of come from the grassroots upwards, not to say that we weren't working on it from the top too. So it's kind of a pincer movement, if you like, to tackle with climate change. The picture on the right is we had a student work with us through the summer of 2019 called Abby, and she carried out some research for us with young people and students in particular to look at the views of young people and the impact of climate change on their lives. Her report is published on our government website, and actually Abby has since gone on to graduate and is currently working with me as part of the team delivering this, which is really exciting for me. So what Abby found, which was very concerning to us, was that 78% of young people that she surveyed said that they were either worried or very worried about climate change. Now, to caveat that, Abby did her internship over the summer holidays, so the schools were shut. She actually spoke to 10% of the population of young people within the age bracket at that time. So she had an awful lot of responses, but I would be naive to suggest that is what absolutely every young person participated in, because of course what we know from all the work we do, we can only speak to the people that we can get hold of, and that's something that we'll come on to a little bit more as we progress. So we've tried really hard to continue to listen to the voices of the islands. I'm not somebody who's just going to read out what's on slides, because I'm sure you can all read them, and I'm sure we can circulate the slides to you if you like afterwards. But basically what we're trying to demonstrate is the whole way through this process, listening to the islanders' voices has been really, really key to us, and continues to be so. So the consultation period that we've currently started today will run to the 31st of January. And like I've already said, there's a clear pathway for how that will feed in. So we talk about the explore phase, which was known to the public as Jersey's Climate Conversation, and that was something that we launched in February 2021. We had planned to do lots of things in 2020, but obviously that didn't happen. So we found ourselves at the end of 2020 having to rethink how we were going to deliver a people-powered process when we were still in a global pandemic, and who could believe we're 12 months down the line and still in a global pandemic, but there we are, it is what it is. So we started our explore phase in February and it ran till April, and we had the Citizens Assembly process that ran until the spring, and then their recommendations were put to the States Assembly in the summer. So what we asked people to do as part of the climate conversation was we set up a website that was separate to the government website, because obviously the information that you expect to see on a government website can be quite formal, a little bit stuffy, maybe the language we use on a government website isn't the language that people in the street would understand too readily. So we felt it was really important to set up something different. We had an online engagement platform called Dialogue that we utilised, and the idea was we could set ideas and questions each week, and that islanders would be encouraged to share their ideas, their thoughts, their feelings, and it was a bit interactive, a bit like a social media platform, in that if somebody else had put an idea up, you could comment on it or like it, or just put your own idea up too. So what we did was we also went out and did a whole load of engagement stuff to fit around that. So it didn't matter if you weren't digital or if you didn't like the platform, there were still lots of opportunities for you to have your say. So each week of the 6 weeks explore phase, we asked a different question. So the first question we asked was, why do we need to talk about climate change? And then what we tried to do through the conversations we'd had online, but also the face-to-face stuff that we'd done, and we pulled it all together and had this beautiful illustration done, which kind of gave us a flavour for really what the island was thinking. So the important part here in the presentation is that was all very lovely, but it was the now what you know, how does that matter? So obviously today, having published the draft carbon neutral roadmap, what we've published at the back of the document is a series of around 30 policies. And what this slide is to show you is the ideas that came out of that Jersey's climate conversation were taken and were then, some of them, not all of them obviously, but the majority of those ideas, or lots of those ideas, have actually progressed on to become things that are in policies. So the one I've circled there was a suggestion when we looked about heating our homes, about using things like passive house techniques. For those of you that don't know, a passive house means that you can heat your home without needing fuel. Primarily, you don't need fossil fuels. So they're quite cheaper homes to run longer term. So they might be more expensive to build, but then once you're in them, they have very, very low running costs. So, and the part of the slide to the right with the second circle, you can see that we've added into the policy a requirement for passive house standards for affordable homes and large commercial developments. So hopefully that gives you that, that journey that we've tried to go on, where we've spoken to people, we've listened, we've heard, and actually we've taken the ideas and the thoughts and they have made it through to policy. So during the climate conversation, this was probably my favourite bit, because I don't know if you've noticed, I quite like talking. So we got to actually go out and talk to islanders, and what we tried to do, bearing in mind that we were quite restricted and we had a lot more planned that we wanted to do, but things with COVID were quite difficult. So we went out and we asked other people to do things for us. So, for example, we provided all of the primary schools in the island with some handmade paper that was infused with seeds from the Jersey Pollinator Group. I know there is a Guernsey Pollinator project as well, and that is a Channel Island project that we work on, but our seed mix is very slightly different to the Guernsey mix, because obviously the pollinators that we have in Jersey and Guernsey are very slightly different. So we had some paper made where we then encouraged children to write their pledges on. They could then plant their pledges and watch them grow. So we were trying to give a bit of an analogy there. We also launched things like a trial of the Green Kitchen Standard. We went into Holier School and planted a tiny forest, which I can only normally refer to as a tiny forest, which is a lot of trees grown in a very unique way that grow really quickly in a very, very dense woodland area. So that's a really nice science project that we've got going. I'm not going to talk through all of the slides. Some of them were about going out and talking to people, but then we also did things like we had a display in the Royal Square where we set out with Acorn all about the importance of reuse and second-hand and not buying new, and trying to get people to understand the emissions of the things that we buy and consume on islands where we don't have massive manufacturing industries, have been produced somewhere else in the world, and that those emissions, although they count in the inventories for those other countries, they actually are our responsibility, because it's our consumerism that is driving those emissions in places, you know, like China and so on. So moving on, we then had our Citizens Assembly on climate change, and all the information about the Citizens Assembly I think has been quite well publicised. But if you go on the Jersey Climate Conversation website, you can read their recommendations report. It's all published on the government website as well. And it was basically 45 randomly selected islanders, and the criteria was you just had to be eligible to vote. You didn't have to actually be registered to vote, but you had to meet the criteria that you could be. So it was anyone aged 16 and above. We worked with an organisation called the Consultation Foundation, who are amazing mathematicians who were able to pull out from the applications that they received 45 people who best represented the demographics of the island in terms of where in the island they live, their age, their socio-economic background, where in the world they were born, that kind of stuff. But we really wanted to make sure that we kept the voice of young people as part of that. So we did quite a big push in secondary schools to make sure that anyone over 16 was able to register their interest. So the invites went to 9,000 households, and from that pot of 9,000 households, there, you know, some households didn't apply, and others, everybody in the house registered, but you could only have one person who actually made it into the chosen 45. So although the picture of the Citizens Assembly doesn't actually mirror what they look like, because it was all held on Zoom, it was all done independently from us, I have been assured that there was somebody with blue hair, which is why second on the back on the right was somebody with blue hair in the picture. So to keep the process independent, it was run by people away from government, and the report that they produced was then presented to the State Assembly and published. And what we've tried to do all the way through is give summary reports, and also, where possible, make resources like films and things so that it's accessible to as many people as possible. So the summary reports we had translated into Portuguese, Polish and Romanian as well, so that we're trying to capture and make sure that as many people in our community as possible could access those reports. So they then came up with their recommendations, and as I said, the recommendations then went to an in-committee debate where they were discussed, and then they were then gone through every single recommendation, and the Minister for the Environment gave his response, which is published, which went through each recommendation and said how many were accepted, how many were rejected, how many were paused until we'd written the carbon neutral roadmap, how many would be paused for a little bit longer until the long-term, medium-term plans, and there were actually a couple of recommendations that were made that were for parishes rather than government, so the government was unable to respond to those. So again, to show you where we fit in, one of the recommendations from the Citizens Assembly, so heating recommendation 1, there was a recommendation that we look to introduce mandatory energy performance certificates. And as you can see on the policy on the right, we have a policy called energy performance certificates. So the idea is the whole way through this process, we've taken on board what people have said, and we'll continue to do that. So I'm going to take a little breath there and stop sharing my screen, because I think this is a question time for the people powered part of it, and then I'll give you the juicy stuff, which is what you want to know, which is what grants are we offering and stuff like that.
Thank you, Jane. That was a whistle-stop tour, and it's clear that a lot has happened over the last couple of years. If anybody has got any questions at this stage, please do put them in the Q&A box. But I'm just going to jump in with one of my own, if that's all right. It's really, really clear that you've put a huge amount of focus on stakeholder and engagement and listen to islanders. And I know that Deputy Young has focused a lot on talking about this people-powered approach as well. How do you balance so many different voices? You know, how have you managed to balance so many different voices, so many different priorities, demands, needs? How have you managed to sort of steer your way through that?
That is a really good question, and I think what we've always had in the back of our minds is when we very first published the carbon neutral strategy back in 2020, there were 5 key principles that were part of that. So we have to remember that the point of what we're doing is to decarbonise our island. So the question around whether we become net zero at 2030 is actually still an open question. I'll just put that bit out there now. So although we were tasked to say, well, how will we get to be carbon neutral by 2030? What carbon neutral basically is it's a set of balancing scales. So what the principle said was reduce as much as you can was the actual term, and then offset the rest. Now, we've not made a decision on whether we're going to buy offsets at 2030 now, because the offset market is still quite a new one. It's very much establishing. There have historically been issues with the offset market. So what we've said is, legitimately, we will reduce our emissions as much as we can by aligning to Paris. What we've done is given ourselves targets, and at a later term of government, when offsets markets are hopefully more mature, that conversation will be made by that term of government, when they're actually making an informed decision based on the current state of play, rather than what we think the state of play will be in at that time. So I guess for a lot of people, they would feel like we didn't listen to that voice, because that voice was become carbon neutral by 2030. And so that's quite an interesting conversation in itself that we've had with people, is explaining that nuanced difference between net zero and carbon neutral. But what we've done by aligning to Paris is we've given ourselves actual targets to reduce. So one of the things I guess that we've found interesting is what we talked about very early on in our conversations and with our expert advisors was that we often hear the same old voices, and that's and I know that's common in a lot of issues, but it's very common environmentally. We have people who are extremely passionate on one hand, and we have people who are still climate deniers on the other hand. So what we've been very clear with in our entire climate conversation is we're not here to debate climate change. The States Assembly actually made that decision in 2014 that climate change is a real thing and that we have to respond to it. So what we've been very clear about is we're not digging up that discussion. We've had that discussion, time's moved on from that, and I think that's quite, for some stakeholders, that's been quite difficult because actually that's the conversation they still want to have, and we're like, you've missed that opportunity, we've moved on. And so we have had some negativity around that. One of the, I don't know if you saw in Guernsey, but one of the things that we did really early on was we painted our climate stripes on quite a prominent wall so that people would see them. And what the climate stripes are, they're an international thing, but it's basically your average annual temperature for the year. So it's essentially a graph that we've painted on a wall, and what it shows is the different temperatures of each year, and there's no surprise that the colours are getting hotter. So we started blue to represent it was cooler, and they're getting hotter. So last year was the second hottest year on record, and the climate stripes reflect that. And those climate stripes, or that mural, has been vandalised twice, potentially by the same person because it's very similar vandalism. But I think that shows that we're still facing that backlash. That's in itself, I find really interesting. I find it very interesting that someone on Christmas Day night went out and did that. I think that says more about them than it does about anything else.
Probably does. Yeah.
But so I think that balance is really hard. And for me, what I've been really, really keen to do is talk to the people we don't normally talk to. So we've been working with, there's a group of outreach workers employed by the Catholic Church who have a lot of outreach workers who go out and support people from different communities, so particularly the Portuguese and the Polish community, who traditionally with government engagement haven't always been a particularly strong voice. So going forward in the consultation, they've actually got translated hard copies of the surveys that they're going to go out and do with people. So I think we've tried to find new ways for engaging with the harder to reach or the seldom heard voices, and I think that's always a challenge. I don't think we've got there. I don't think we've answered that right. We've done a lot of work with the youth service, with the youth parliament. Obviously, I came from a youth background, so young people I'm extremely passionate to represent. But what we took a group of young men from one of the secondary schools who their behaviour has warranted them to not be in mainstream lessons. They're not the kind of lads that normally would talk to government about anything. And what we did is we went out and we built a pollinator patch with them. So we had them with spades, and while they were digging, they were chatting, and we were able to record those conversations. So what we're trying to do is find completely different ways of getting out and talking to people. Where we've struggled is that it's exceedingly resource intensive, and in a very, very tiny team. Normally I'm a team on my own. I have got Abby with me at the moment. For me to actually go out and deliver that is very hard. When we first started with the People-Powered approach, what we really wanted was for the community to then take this and run with it themselves, so that it wasn't us having to deliver everything, about that collective responsibility. Hand on heart, that didn't work. I think a lot of that was because of COVID and the timing we had. So, we launched the Explore phase last February. We'd all had in Jersey a pretty miserable Christmas. Christmas was kind of cancelled. We were still, schools were all up in the air. Life wasn't normal. So it was that I think presented a much bigger challenge. So I still don't know that we've got that right. But we're always trying.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a continual process. It's quite iterative, I'm sure. And in fact, that sort of cuts straight to one of the questions that I've got in the Q&A box from Katrina. It says, looking back, would you have changed anything about the way you engaged with the public? I mean, you've talked about how intensive it is, but then good stakeholder engagement is intensive. It's not easy.
Absolutely.
So would you have changed anything?
Well, yeah, we wouldn't have had COVID, obviously.
Yeah.
The Citizens' Assembly would have run smoothly and in person instead of online. That would have been great. But I think what I would have changed is I think we ended up, because of the situation we were in, running everything in a very condensed timescale. So from the public perception, it probably looks like we've done very little in terms of engagement, because gathering and taking that information and doing something meaningful with it is really time consuming. We literally finished the explore phase the day that we started the first Citizens' Assembly session, and I think what I would have liked to have done better if we were ever to do this again, I would have liked a better gap in between those two processes so that we could make the stuff that the islanders have come up with far more front and centre of the Citizens' Assembly than maybe we were able to do at the beginning sessions. That would definitely be something that I would look to change. I think it's having time. I think that's, if I could change anything, it would be to give us more time. But we're very bound by political cycles. Absolutely, would I have chosen to publish on the 17th of December? Of course, I wouldn't have chosen to publish on the 17th of December. I certainly wouldn't be looking to close a consultation on the 31st of January. It's going to be really tough for us to get real good quality feedback from people. But we have to lodge March in order to get it debated in April to get it in this term of government. And so we're very constrained by political cycles. So, if I was, as a warts and all, that's what I would change. I would give us more time to dive deeper.
I've got another question here, which you may by now sort of slightly answer, but I'll just dive into it. Rosie says that it's clear that you've considered carefully these many stakeholder groups. It's clear how much work you've done and how best to communicate what are often complex issues. But she's asking, how do you feel the public in Jersey has engaged? Do you think that if you stopped someone in the street that they would say, yes, I feel engaged with, or not?
It's a really interesting question. I think people surprise me. So a friend of mine has got a sciatica at the moment and went for a massage, and she's a colleague, and she said what we were working on at the moment, and the masseuse was like, I'm so supportive of this is amazing, knew all about it.
Brilliant.
So I think there are pockets of people that know loads. I think the general public, there's still a lot of people that don't understand. There's an awful lot of misinformation, and it's one of those brilliant topics that conspiracy theories run rife, probably not on the same par as with other things that we've seen lately, but I think there's a lot around there's a lot of fear. There's a fear that the government is doing this to people rather than it's a collective responsibility. I think there's still very much, I don't know is the answer. I think if you stop the right person, they'd know loads about it. If you stop the person they're with, they might know nothing about it. So I don't know. And I think, to me, that's why when I was asked to do this presentation, I'm like, this group's phenomenal group to come talk to, because you're the people that go out and talk to people. So if I can get you on board, then I'm hopefully sorted.
Oh, excellent. Well, we're really pleased for you to come and speak to us today. There's two other questions on the chat, on the Q&A, but they're sort of slightly more focused on the sort of technicalities of emissions, for example. And I'm conscious of time, so we've got about sort of 20 minutes before it's 2 o'clock, and I know you've got a little bit more to present, Jane. I'm just wondering whether we go back to your presentation now, and we can pick up on some questions at the end, and then obviously then if people need to leave, then they can do. But I'm conscious that we have got some questions. I'm not ignoring them, but I'm also conscious that you've got a little bit more to get through.
Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen again, and we'll go back into the right mode, hopefully. I'm not sure it's working this time. Hang on, we'll try this again. I'm quite new to Zoom, I'm afraid.
Give it another go, Jane.
Yeah, we're big on Teams here, so fingers crossed.
I can see your screen.
Can you?
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting, because I can just see me this time. So if you can see it, we'll carry on. So I've called this the juicy bit. I think this is what a lot of people actually really want to know. on a non-professional basis, but also for your clients too, is what do the policies say? So this diagram, I don't know how it ended up so complicated. It started off just as a really simple thing, but once again, we've managed to overcomplicate things. What this is showing us is, I've already said transport and heating are our two main sources of emissions. So what this is showing us is that these are the blue circles are our deliverables. So they're things that will be coming in that we've got dates for. The red triangles are our milestones, and the dark blue squares are decisions that we know are coming up. So for example, if we look at the transport line, we can see that we are looking for some EV incentives to come in 2022, so EV by electric vehicles, I mean. We can see that the new bus contract will be renewed in 2025, and that in terms of milestones, we hope to have a zero carbon fleet just after 2026. So you can see some of the milestones. So the next bit of the slide, and this is something I'd really like you guys to participate in. We've also got the same set out for our on and off island emissions and our enabling policies, but the row at the bottom is where what we would really like is to encourage businesses, community groups, islanders, individuals, families, whomever, to share their milestones, deliverables and decisions to be made with us so that we can start to populate this. So it might be a family who is going to say that, you know, they're going to get a home energy audit done on one of the lines, but it also might be that your business is going to, I don't know, offset all of its off-island flights by a certain date, and that is something you could share with us so that we can see Jersey's commitments. So it's the island-wide carbon neutral roadmap. So we're quite keen that people, as part of this consultation, start to share that with us where possible. So that, as we've already discussed, there are 4 categories of policies in the roadmap. They are no surprise. So the transport and the heating policies are very much around emissions reduction. So what made the cut was stuff that is actually going to reduce our emissions. The other on and off island emissions policies are policies that are going to tackle some other categories of emissions on islands, but also look at our global impact. And then the enabling policies, which I'm not going to go into massively in this, are really the stuff that will allow us to implement this, to bring about the change we need, and to make sure that that's all done fairly. So I'm not going to read every policy, please don't worry, but the ones that I will pull out for your attention, which I think may interest you, would be one of the transport policy number 1, which you can see what that's looking at is speeding up the adoption of electric vehicles. So what the draft, and remember, we want your feedback on this. So what the draft carbon neutral roadmap is saying is we're proposing that there will be a £3,500 up to £3,500 incentive or grant, if you like, to buy an electric vehicle. So it doesn't have to be a car, it could be maybe a motorbike, it could be a small van, but we're trying to be mindful that we always make the commitment to reflect on a just transition. So it's making sure that the right people get the grants for the right things. So what we've done is we've put a proposed cap on that so that the vehicles that they need to buy would need to be under £30,000. Because basically, if you're buying a 60 grand car, you probably don't need a £3,500 incentive to get you to do that. That's our line of thinking, but the feedback we might get might be quite different to that. There'll be incentives also within there. The idea is that is on new or second-hand cars, but they're newly registered to Jersey. So you can buy through a local garage potentially, who can import a second-hand vehicle for you that's cheaper already, and you would still be eligible to apply for that. So we've got a bit of a carrot there. Other carrots there would be things like continued to have subsidised parking for electric vehicles, but maybe a stick would be for the fossil fuel people, would be around the vehicle emission duty incentive, which is actually in policy number 4 there. But what we're saying for the speeding up of adoption, that those vehicles would be, they wouldn't be subject to vehicle emissions duty because they're not emitting anything. The other policy that I think people will be particularly interested in transport is around vehicle scrappage scheme. So the idea is we want to get the most polluting cars off the road. So any vehicle that's over 10 years old, and I imagine is worth less than £500 probably, we will give what we're calling green living credit to basically incentivise people to scrap their cars. That money can be used really on what we would say, things like you could buy a bus pass, or you might look at buying into something like a car sharing app, or you might want to buy a new bike or an electric bike or something like that. So something that will get a polluting vehicle off the road. We're also looking to subsidise second generation renewable diesel. So for a lot of people, you'd call that biodiesel. And that's recognising that a lot of our big heavy vehicles, so our lorries, our construction plant type stuff, there aren't electric or alternative versions out there at the moment. So a biodiesel could be a really interesting transition fuel until maybe technology catches up and we find ourselves with hydrogen vehicles, stuff like that. So that's a couple of the transport policies. There are all sorts of other ones in there. I guess what I really need to say around the transport is that we will be publishing next week our interim update on the sustainable transport policy, and within that there's a move to have a long-term sustainable transport plan, and a lot of the active travel, so the cycling and walking infrastructure and the bus stuff, will be picked up in that work stream. So if you're looking and thinking that the carbon neutral roadmap is a little bit weak on some of that stuff, it's because actually it's being picked up in a specific work stream just focusing on those. We then look at heating. So we know that we have lots of oil and gas boilers in Jersey, and if we're going to decarbonise our island by 2050, we need to get those oil and gas boilers out of people's homes by 2050. So the idea is that we will have a grant in place, very similar to the electric car thing, that we will replace, there'll be an incentive to replace an oil or a gas boiler. What we're not going to do is come in and take your boiler off you. We know boilers have a life of around 10, maybe if we're really lucky 15 or a bit years. So for us to get rid of them all out of your homes by 2050, there will come a point where you won't be able to buy a replacement oil or gas boiler. And so you will need to find alternatives. So we will be giving 50% funding, although you might get a boiler for cheaper than that. The money can also be used on home insulation. So by swapping your boiler to a low carbon one, you can also upgrade the insulation and the energy efficiency of your home. But interestingly, in this one, we are offering to give double the money to low-income households, so that they're not expected to actually pay anything to upgrade their boiler, because we think that would be grossly unfair and would prevent people from participating. So there's lots of work around things like building bylaws, and something that's quite interesting is the idea of energy performance certificates. They're already mandatory in the UK and Europe, but what we're looking at in Jersey is they would be phased in at point of sale or rental. So what you will see potentially is when people come to buy or rent a property, that they will be looking a bit like when you buy a washing machine for that standard on their property, so that they can see how much it will cost them to heat it going forward. Other policies that are in there, I'm not going to go into these because I think you probably want a bit longer for questions, but you will see that we've made a commitment, for example. So as I said right at the start, we manage our waste in Jersey differently to Guernsey. We have an energy from waste facility that has emissions that comes from it. So what we're looking at is decarbonising our waste management system. And looking at things like carbon capture as a short term until the energy recovery facility reaches the end of its life. So there's a lot of work around there. There are things about F-gases. F-gases, primarily refrigerant. So if you're in an office that's air conditioned, you can find alternative gases to make you cooler rather than just greenhouse gases. But again, coming back to retrofitting and modern build standards, actually do away with the need to cool buildings through design. We do have one greenhouse gas category that is purely around the gas that goes into squirty cream, which amuses our team quite greatly, that we actually basically report squirty cream consumption. So there are policies in there around that, and what that really says is that the industry needs to come up with an alternative propellant themselves. It's probably not something the government of Jersey can do. So there's all sorts of different things in there. Sustainable finance, obviously, will probably interest a lot of your clients. So, you know, really the biggest impact Jersey and Guernsey can have globally is about looking at our finance sectors and reviewing where as government we invest, but also where our finance industry has a really strong voice globally. The enabling policies are a lot of the background stuff, things about, you know, as a government, we need to practice what we preach, but also looking at things like the skills in the supply chain. So in the UK, they've talked a lot about green jobs. I'm trying not to use the term green job because they should just be jobs as we go forward. So, you know, we know, for example, if we're going to have a lot more electric vehicles, we need people who can maintain those vehicles. The same with boilers and stuff. We've also, Jersey and Guernsey made a commitment at COP26 around education. And so we have a policy in there about delivering that and the importance of education in the climate change sphere. We have some really exciting policies, I think, in there about blue carbon, biodiversity and sequestration. So really getting to grips with the potential for sequestration from our seabeds. That's currently not something that is accounted for in our greenhouse gas inventory. That's a global thing, but there are moves to have that changed. So it would be for new or improved seabeds rather than what we've already got. And again, the last policy there is really about that policy position on when we're going to make the decision to offset. So the consultation's open. If you feel you would like to have your say, you're very welcome to go on and complete the very short survey, which is gov.je/carbon roadmap. But we're also really asking people to send us things like written submissions on behalf of businesses. We will be doing focus groups, we'll be doing stakeholder consultation sessions. Quite what they look like today, I don't know. If we'd had this 3 days ago, I would have given you a very clear lowdown on what we thought we were going to be up to, but now it looks like we'll probably be doing most of it virtually again. So please don't ask me too much about how it's going to look, because I don't know. And that's what the consultation page looks like. And that is the end of my slide. So hopefully we've now got time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Jane. Brilliant. And in fact, you answered my question there, which was, you know, what's next for the consultation period? How are you going to communicate? What are your comms plans coming up? And of course, everything's a little bit up in the air right now. So watch this space, I guess. But I'm assuming you're going to continue to sort of push that out on social media and on the website that you've talked about and through more traditional media.
Yeah, so we obviously had a huge number of face-to-face events that we were planning with lots of our key stakeholders. So before we launched this, we did quite a lot of pre-stakeholder briefings. So particularly for businesses that might be super impacted. So we have a group called the Energy Forum, made up of all of the energy providers. So your likes of Jersey Gas and the oil companies, as well as Jersey Electricity. So they've been party to this the whole way through. But we've also been meeting with people like the Motor Traders Federation, because actually this could be a good thing for them, but some of them might be quite nervous about the move away from combustion engine vehicles. So quite how we deliver what we had planned through a virtual space, because it's great coming and doing a presentation, but actually what I really need is the feedback from people. And so we need to think really creatively about how we're going to be able to do those discussions and gather that and capture that kind of, and actually the Citizens Assembly was a really good practice for us, that we were able to do that, but it was hugely resource intensive again. So quite what we do, I guess we'll be using Mentimeter and things like that quite a lot, mirror boards and all of those. But if any of you have any bright ideas of, you know, something that you've seen that you think's really affected, I would totally be all ears to that.
Well, Katrina, one of our attendees, Katrina, has said, you know, actually, what can we as PR professionals do to help over this sort of next stage? So, you know, please do reach out, and you know, if there's any particular actions that you'd like the people on this webinar to take, then go for it, go large.
Yeah, so we'd obviously love you to participate in the actual consultation and get your clients to do that. So when we did the Citizens Assembly, we went out and said to the business community, send us a written submission, which will be presented to them. And I think that's really important, that actually the survey's great. I mean, we look at kind of engagement as a bit of a triangle. You know, the survey, we can get to lots of people, but we don't get much detail out of that. The next stage up is kind of presenting smaller, you know, bigger kind of workshops, and then the real juicy stuff is kind of, you know, we've got focus groups and things planned, which will move online, I imagine, but you know, they can still happen. But I guess for us, it's that real quality, in-depth feedback that we want. So any clients that you're working with, or yourself as an organisation, you know, I had a really, really interesting chat with our own web team yesterday about the carbon footprint of a PDF, as I was merrily PDFing all of our documents for print, and you know, being told what the carbon footprint of a PDF is, which, you know, to me, we've got low carbon electricity, it doesn't even exist as a real thing. How can it have a footprint? You know, so it's that real, you know, I'm not an expert in everything, obviously, but it's, you know, I need you to help as much as you can in whichever ways you see appropriate, I guess.
That's great, and I'm sure that we'll do so. I'm conscious of time. It's just before 2 o'clock. What I'm thinking is that we do have 2 questions on the board, but they're sort of technical climate change focused questions, and for some people attending, that might be a step too far, and they may need to crack on with their day. So what I'm going to suggest, James, is that I finish out this session, but if you would like to loiter, and those who've asked those questions might like to loiter, and anybody else who's interested in the finer detail of CO2 emissions, then, you know, please do stay on. But for others, please do feel that you can slip away and get on with your day. I'd just like to say thank you so much, Jane. It's been really interesting. It's been brilliant to get it from the horse's mouth and to get the sort of journey that you've taken. I think as communications professionals, we really appreciate the amount of work that goes into that kind of stakeholder engagement. And I've been particularly struck by how you've really made this big conscious effort to communicate with different groups of people in ways that suit them, not you. And that doesn't always happen. And I think, you know, from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you've worked really hard on that. So it's been quite interesting to hear your different ways of engaging with stakeholders. So thank you for that. If you are a CIPR member, you can log points, 5 CPD points from today. So please do remember to do that. If you're not a CIPR member, please join us. We have an amazing sort of support network in the Channel Islands for PR professionals, some brilliant local events, but membership also opens up you know, members to a huge array of courses and events from different groups, professional groups in different regions around the country. So I do highly recommend membership, and keep in touch with us over social media. We will have an event plan coming together in early 2022, and we hope to see you, many of you, at those events. And I'll leave you by saying, you know, happy Christmas, and take care, everybody out there, and you know, stay well. And if anybody wants to stay on, I think Jane's got a couple of minutes. I know she won't have long either, but maybe we can just quickly look at those 2 last technical questions. Thank you very much. So just, Jane, I've got, there were 2 technical questions up. So one from Will, buying offsets is arguably the easy cop-out, he says. What strategy do you have to work industry by industry on island to review their individual performances?
Well, I totally agree with you. And I think that's why we've aligned ourselves with Paris, because the original wording of being carbon neutral, just reduce as much as you can. I look at the efforts my son puts into tidying his bedroom. He thinks he's put in a lot of effort. I think he's put in no effort. So if we use that as an analogy for reducing our emissions, he totally saying that, and he's not a bad lad. If we use that as the definition of carbon neutrality, you could put what you think is a massive effort and make no difference, and then just buy your way out of it by buying offsets. And we were always really mindful of that, and that doesn't feel right, and it's not in the spirit of what tackling the climate emergency is meant to be, and it's ultimately just massive greenwashing, isn't it? So by aligning ourselves with the Paris trajectory, we're doing what the science-led what the scientists are telling us to do. You know, we're about limiting the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, and that's what that trajectory is going to do to us. And so whether we choose to buy offsets at 2030 or not is up in the air. And that's part of the reason why that's up in the air. You know, if we haven't reduced as much as we can, we would be ultimately greenwashing. So yeah, it's a very fair point. It's something that we're very, very mindful of. Interesting that the kind of offsets you can buy in net zero is about abatement. So it is stuff, if you like, that sucks up carbon. So that might sound really obvious, but a lot of offsets are actually about replacing. So you might, for example, replace LED lights in some countries, and that would be considered carbon reduction because it depends how your electricity is made, where these are actually about, I don't really know how else to put it, sucking up and storing the carbon rather than reducing. So that feels a bit better, but you're absolutely right. The carbon offsets market has been a controversial one at best. So yeah, good point.
And then I've got one final question. They haven't shared their name, unfortunately, but the person says, when I choose to cycle to work, I don't stop emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. I just put less in than I drive. Can Jane help me understand how Jersey can balance emissions at zero without taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and locking it away into a sink? Technical question, Jane?
Brilliant question. And I think it's actually probably the most fundamental question. So when we're talking about climate change and fossil fuels, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, so there's the carbon cycle. So you're absolutely right. Everything, I'm breathing out carbon right now. We're all emitting carbon. That's not the issue. The issue is the release of the carbon from the fossil fuels. So this is carbon that has been captured. So if you look at oil, it's carbon that's been stored and put away that we're now setting back into the live carbon cycle. I've got some really nice, and I don't want to sound patronising, and I'm very aware that I might do, but we've got some really nice resources that have been done for schools that explain this really well, because it's a very visual thing. So you've got the, you know, if you think back at school, you've got the existing life cycle of carbon, if you like, a bit like the water cycle. You know, the water just keeps going round and round and round, and carbon's very much like that. But this is about the carbon that's being released back out. So stuff that isn't in that round and round and round, that is then joining in and going round and round and round, and adding in and going round and round and round. And that's the problem, is that it's the stuff that's being released back out. That's really poorly explained, and I am embarrassed about that, sorry.
But it does sound like there's some good resources. So clearly
there are some really good, and I would say places like BBC Bitesize are fantastic.
Brilliant, those,
yeah. So for things like understanding the carbon cycle, so you know, you could get into it's the biogenic, you could get into all sorts of technical, and this is one of the fundamental problems with climate change. Is it is extremely difficult to explain to people, and people can't see it as much. I mean, I know we're starting to see extreme weather patterns, and we're starting to see some of the impacts. Small island communities, you know, if the Condor ferry doesn't get in with our food on it because there's been a lot of storms, then we're all quite connected to that, where maybe the mainland in the UK aren't as connected to that. But actually a lot of these, and this is what I was saying at the start, you know, a lot of what we talk about is really technical, it's quite scientific, and not everybody wants to or needs to necessarily understand all the science. And that's, to me, why the education pledge is so important in terms of the enabling policies, because it's not just about schools. We've put in there, you know, the pledge that was made is it's about lifelong learning, and it's about helping people. And that's what we need to be better at, is communicating some really difficult messages in a way that people understand it. And it's quite, you know, good comms can be very expensive. You know, if you're having things animated or designed to help you tell that story, you know, where the money could be better spent on giving people an actual grant to change their boiler or to explain it. And it's a real balance, and that's, you know, the policies are trying to find that balance.
Yeah, it is. And I think you're absolutely right about the comps. You know, it's really complicated. It's really challenging
to do it badly.
Yeah, and there's a lot of risk. You know, if you get it wrong, then there's, you know, huge risk of reputation damage, and of course of being accused of greenwashing, etc. And I think we'll,
unfortunately, I'm going to have to go.
We're going to have to close it off here. But
after coming in,
there's so much to talk about. And Jane, thank you so much. And, you know, we're going to be revisiting this topic again and again and again. So, you know, we will be having other events, and I can already see an opportunity for you to maybe come back and talk to us some more about some of those complications.
Yeah, more than happy to. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm sorry I have to dash.
No dash. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us.